Hello and welcome to History of Psychology. Welcome back. All right, we're going to the Renaissance today. We are going to Italy. So I have my Italian fan from Venice. So here it is. Okay. So we have to prepare to go to Italy. So it's very exciting. We're traveling. We're world travelers, and today is our going back in time to the Italian Renaissance. Renaissance, if anybody speaks Italian. Not me, but anyway. Okay, let's go ahead and pull up the slides. Except I think I have them on the wrong one. Okay, so let's share the slides. And there you go. All right, Italian Renaissance, 1450 to 1600. It's the rebirth of the modern period from 1650 to 1945, empiricism, associationism, and nativism. Okay, these are the things that we're going to be talking about today. This is probably one of our longer lectures, covering more information. In general, lectures that are in class take longer because we're answering questions, we're having conversations, we're engaging. Whereas if I'm just talking, I'm talking to the screen, I might start talking a little faster and there just isn't that engagement. So things go by a little faster. So if that's why you're wondering about the length of the lectures in difference to class, usually we do about 20 slides per lecture in class. 20 slides in this kind of environment could take less than a half an hour. All right, this one's about 36 slides. Okay, let's get going and stop with the boring. All right, so we have the fall of the Roman Empire in Greece. All right, so this is very exciting. We're in Greece. It's Renaissance in Europe, and it's nearly 1,000 years have passed between the ancient philosophers to the Renaissance. So we were last in Greece, and we talked about Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, and now we're in Italy. All right, so as again, we're traveling around the world. So the Renaissance began in Florence, Italy, spreading throughout Europe. The early Middle Age is considered the Dark Ages, so the 9th century to sort of year 1000. Beginning with the fall of the Roman Empire in Greece, followed by in 9th century, the Emperor Charlemagne of Europe's life story was published. Charlemagne, the Emperor Charlemagne, was based in Germany, and he was the emperor of the entire European continent. And if you go to near Bonn, is a small city, and you can see Charlemagne's cathedral, and you can experience all things Charlemagne. It's a very, very beautiful, original small town city. The outskirts of the city are very modern, but once you get to the interior, you'll see this beautiful environment where Charlemagne was, and there's the Museum of Charlemagne. Definitely worth going to on your real travel to Italy. All right, 13th century was established 14 universities, including Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. All right, so we're starting to have this establishment. The 14th century saw civil war and plague in Europe. And of course, both of these are sad because it results in loss of life. So this was the context in which the Renaissance sort of came out of, sort of looking for joy and excitement. So the Renaissance, geographically, it takes place in Italy, the first part of it. We're going to talk about Descartes in this particular lecture. There's actually two parts to the lecture. We're going to talk about his lifestyle, his contributions to psychology. All right, so Florence, Italy. This is a map right here on the upper right-hand corner of Italy. I've often said it looks like a boot, and it's sort of in the southern part of the European map. Florence is upper here in the northern part, not on the coast. So you've got your red arrow pointing to, and Firenze is the Italian way of saying Florence. So you're in Italy. So say it like the Italian, Firenze. And here, get your, my thing out. Okay. So Florence, Italy, the climate was cool to cold in the winter, hot and humid in the summers. So similar still temperature. The Italian government during that time period in 15th century Italy was divided into into city states, with Florence being one of them. There was multiple city states. Each state had their own government, and individual freedom was granted. The image here on the bottom right is what Florence looks like if you went today, and it's what Florence looked like in the 15th century. This bridge, this bottom bridge right here, was built to be a covered bridge because on this side, the left, is where the palace was. And if the emperor or the king at the time wanted to get across to the other side to some other governing bodies or to go to the cathedral, he didn't want to have anything happen to him. So they created this covered bridge, which has a fabulous name, which I'm not remembering right now. Anyway, so it has these brown rooftops and this beautiful river. And all of this still exists today. And there's shops as well in here as there was during the time period. Okay, Florence. So Italian government with city states. All right, so what did people wear during that time period? What was the economy like? What were jobs and activities? A lot of times what we're going to be seeing as far as images of any kind of, this was the upper class. This is very fine material and fine outfits. And again, this would be a clergyman here, and we would have, wine and so forth. All right, so Florence was a wealthy city, so many people look this way. But of course, there would have been the people that were unemployed or were doing the work, and they were not dressing like these people in the pictures. Florence could support the early Renaissance. So a lot of the Renaissance occurred in Florence. It included textile workers, bankers, masons, builders, sculptors, lawyers, and solicitors, painters, but also people that had to do like street sweeping and so many other of the basic jobs, the infrastructure that we think about, and doing the building. So there was so much that was involved, and there still is if you think about a society. So all those jobs existed as well. Activities included playing games or jousting, if you've ever been to the Renaissance Fair. And any state, you'll see the people on horses with the long sticks, and they charge towards each other. And the goal is to knock each other off, kill each other, stab each other with this giant stick on a horseback. Okay, playing music. Music, of course, didn't sound like the music we think of today, but every generation has a different sound to their music. Now, the music in Italy during that time period, during the Renaissance, would have been different because of different type of instrument, like the lute. There's this sort of a small image of a lute here. And the sound of it would have been more tingy sounding. And of course, painting and sculpting were things that people were engaged with, but they were spending time with family. Religion was very important, and people went to church and they had family activities. So who was our person that we're going to talk about? Who is our scholar? Well, Rene Descartes. He was born in 1596 and he lived till 1650. This is an image of Descartes. He has beatnik Beatles hairdo. His hairstyle is, we will see this over and over, different styles of clothing and hair will change with time. Many of the jobs, like the infrastructure jobs, remain the same, street sweeping, except then they used a little broom, and now we use giant machines that run up the streets. So many similarities, but how it's done is very different. So Rene Descartes, let's talk about his lifestyle and how it might have influenced him. He was born near Tours, France, and his mother died a year after his birth. He his mother died of tuberculosis, and his father was a very wealthy lawyer. And so he gave Descartes a monthly stipend to focus on learning. He found learning to be very important, and he felt that he should really spend a lot of time doing it. So Descartes' early education was provided by Jesuit monks within in his area where he lived. And having all this money allowed Descartes to really focus on education because he didn't have to focus on the everyday task. He had things that people did for him, such as cleaning the house or cooking the food. So it freed him up from the necessity of work and to instead to focus on his work. So he trained as a lawyer. He was also a soldier, and he became a scholar later on in Holland. Descartes, as a young person, was actually a frail person. He had frail health. Um, and he later graduated from the Jesuit school at the age of 16. All right, so we don't have a lot of information on his later education and what he might have done to educate himself, but we know that at 23, Descartes focused on the mind, a philosophical system grounded in mathematics and rationalism. This Queen of Sweden requested him to be a private tutor for her in Sweden. Sweden, in this little map over here on the right, is the country in the red. And remember, Italy's all the way down here and the southern part of Europe where it's nice and warm, where Sweden's up here in the north where it's cold. And Descartes didn't have the best health when he was a young man. And going on to later life, he didn't have great health then either. He really loved to sort of sleep in and lie around in bed and think and stay warm. And that was a pattern that he had into his adulthood. But at one point, the queen liked to meet him, and she wanted him to come and be her tutor. And she said, I want to meet early in the morning. Well, this was his time, but of course she was the queen and he was the tutor. He worked for her, and so the climate was much colder in Sweden. And later, early on in life, Descartes died in Stockholm, and pretty much from the cold. It did not suit his body and his health. Okay, what can we learn about the discoveries of Rene Descartes? Well, Descartes, if we look at this image on the right, oopsie daisy, he had discourse on method. And then, of course, there was another person after him, Spinoza, who looked at ethics, and then Leibniz, who was the mondology. All right, now these are the rationalists that when we think about this time period. Now, Descartes was the first of the new philosophers, and he left writings on math, physics, and metaphysics. He influenced the creation of rationalism, emphasizing the use of ideas, reason, and logic as the primary sources of knowledge. And it was the opposite philosophy of empiricism, to be discussed later. So rationalism was in opposition to empiricism. Right, and this was occurring in the same time period. So Descartes stated, in Latin, which I cannot say, I think, therefore I am. So this is the phrase that comes from him. And this is a historical statement that brings to the forefront his emphasis on the reasons as the foundation of knowledge, that reason is the foundation of knowledge. I think, therefore I am. So he reasoned, and if I am capable of reasoning, then I exist. Now, Descartes really had this idea of mind-body dualism. All right, he believed the split of the body and the mind. He said the body was one part and the mind was a separate part. So the mind was spiritual and the body was the physical part of it. We now know he wasn't correct, but he was the first to say, these two things are important. And he really focused on the pineal gland in the brain, and that's where sensations are reunified for presentation of the soul. Now, so how he did some of his work and started to think about visual perception is that he actually took an ox, and how he got his eyes, I don't know, but he actually took the eyes and he was able to put light behind them, and he was able to see through the back of them. And he could see that with a paper, he could see that the eye was inverted. All right, things were upside down, which is why this arrow is like this. So we look, it goes the opposite direction. All right, so he was the first person to realize, looking through eyes. What does it look like using ox eyes? Okay, kind of disgusting, but how else are we going to figure it out if we don't have apparatus? So this was the beginning of figuring things out, and working with animals was a common thing. Now, hopefully the animal was not killed just to look through his eyes. Let's not think about it. Moving on. Okay, so one of the other things that he talked about is that he said he developed the Cartesian coordinates that are used in graphs based on geometry. So we have the origin point right here in the middle, and then you have your coordinate points of X and Y. X and Y. All right. And so the the horizontal axis, which is the X, and the vertical axis, which is the Y. When you look at graphs, this is called the Cartesian coordinates. So it comes from Descartes. He actually came up with this idea, and it was useful and is useful today for comparing data sets and comparing trends. It was very important. Um, Descartes really thought a lot about the brain, and he said the when we said that the mind and the body are separate, he said the brain fluid contained, spirits, and he believed in this dualism versus a native perspective. Okay, let me move this. All right. So for centuries, well, let's go. Currently in psychology, rationalism is rationalization. So this was the construct that Descartes was talking about, and it's a defense mechanism in which people justify difficult or unacceptable feelings with logical reasons and explanations. And this is his contribution to psychology today. Now, the Cartesian dualism, the split of body and mind, as I was talking about, we can give credit to the theory of mind-body interaction really paved the way for the study of the conscious. So Freud really picked up on this idea developed by Descartes that we had this a conscious mind, and that was separate from the body because that's where the spirit was. The nervous system and the brain are the control centers that regulate behavior. So we're starting to think about these. And of course, the other construct that he developed was the Cartesian coordinates, which is the line graph of the X and the Y coordinates. Whenever you look at data, we are able to display it and recognize which one is the X and which one is the Y. For centuries, philosophers argued about what was more important, the inborn nature of the individual or the environmental influences from nurturing the individual. So which do you think is more important in the building of an individual? Which one is it? Well, um, both supported Descartes' theory of separate mind and body through different lenses. Their philosophical ideas, particularly Leibniz, kept Descartes' ideas alive for further discussion long after Descartes had died in 1650. Spinoza, he was from Amsterdam, of Jewish faith, originally from Portugal. Now, these are the rationalists, all right, again. And Leibniz is from Leipzig, Germany. And both of them We don't have strong contributions from them, but what we do have is the fact that they continued the ideas and carried them on because events lived till 1716. So, in other words, they're educating more people and sharing the ideas, and that's what's really important. All right, so that was the Renaissance. And the most important person is Descartes and his ideas on the mind and body, on the unconscious mind, the Cartesian coordinates, and also starting to think about, looking through the eyes and looking and seeing that things were upside down when we look through them. So we started to have more information about physiology. Now, all of this contributes towards the development of psychology. Now, the modern period that takes off from here is 1650 to 1945. And on our adventure around the world, we're going to move to England, Ireland, and Scotland. We're going to talk about John Locke and George Berkeley. I feel like we're going to talk about someone else, but we'll find out in a minute. Okay, so the post-Renaissance period. Yes, we are talking about someone else. We're going to talk about John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. All right, but all three of these men were from England. All right. So the climate, again, dry for many seasons, but it was remarkably cold, unusually so compared to the 20th and 21st century during the winter. The ground was frozen. It was a very uncomfortable time, and they didn't have the clothing in it to wear properly. So in England, during the government of the 17th, 18th century, so again, United Kingdom is England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, was run by the king. They had many colonies, including the United States, that were run by governors. All right, so right here is London, and here is England, and Wales is right here, and Scotland is all the way over here, and Ireland is over here. All right. Stupid mouse. All right, so these are going to be relevant as we move forward our conversation. The University of Edinburgh, Scotland, and Kilkenny, Ireland. All right, so the economy during that time period, England was a wealthy economy. The jobs included tailors, cloth weavers, fishmongers, grocers, vintners that made wine, skinners that got the fur off, haberdashers, they worked at, it's equivalent of working at Walmart, domestic staff for the gentry, building laborers, and many, many unemployed people. This is an image here of King George, and it took a lot of people to create his clothes, and that was a wig, of course, and they would wear powder on their faces or grease paint, and they didn't wash very often. This would be something like the outfits that the ladies of that time period would have worn, and this would have been the upper class ladies. The activities included painting and art and visiting friends for tea, attending various fairs. Fireworks were very common, music, plays, animal fights, fighting animals, eating competitions, gambling. Gambling is something that still today can be found in England. It's very popular. Okay, so what was the economy like? Well, the majority of the people of Ireland were Catholic, all right? And the peasants were very poor and this has a lot to, had to do with their say in politics. They didn't have a lot to do with a say in politics because the king lived in England, and therefore, if you remember the look of the map, London was down at the bottom, and then Ireland and Scotland, Wales and Scotland were at the very top, and Ireland's to the side on a little island. And so the king didn't live there, and the king's people didn't live there. So they didn't have a lot of say, and they would make these rules, and they didn't work for these other countries. And it's been a problem for many, many years and continues to be. And that's why politically, if you've ever followed the government. That's why Scotland wanted to separate. Ireland has wanted to separate from England because they want it to be from the United Kingdom. They want it to be their own country, and Britain is considered just England, London, and England, that lower part of it. Okay, jobs at the time included farmers, laborers. They raised pigs. That's why there's a picture here of people raising pigs, and there's farmers, and there's people walking and carrying, and young children taking care of other young children, because mothers and fathers in the poorer environments would have been working. They would have been working in the house, they would have been working in the fields, they would have been making clothing, making candles. There was a lot of work to do. All right. Activities in Ireland would have been Irish dancing, and these young boys here were actually Irish dancers. They're clog dancers. Ooh, this mouse. And they would visit friends. Few details are available about country life in Ireland, except we do know certain things, like there was a time period of the potato famine and there was a lot of starvation, but it's not really relevant to our conversation today. All right, so the people that we're really going to talk about today are Jean Locke from 1632 to 1704, and this is the post-Renaissance scholars. And then, of course, George Berkeley and David Hume. All right, so they started off in 1632 and they go all the way to 1776. So each of these men was either born in Ireland, England, or Scotland. So let's talk about John Locke first. John Locke, born in 1632, was born middle class in Riddington, England. His father was a lawyer who supported both of his sons' education. He would have been a gentleman scholar, just like Descartes. Descartes was a gentleman scholar because he didn't have to work. His father paid for everything and made sure he had enough money. And he instilled Puritan values of sobriety, discipline, and working hard that Locke carried with him. Locke may have witnessed the execution of King Charles I, because we do know that one of his very close friends saw this and wrote about it. And it's very likely that Locke went with him, and this would have had an impact. So we say that lifestyle and family influenced their ideas. In some cases, it gave them time to focus. It said they were hardworking, but it also meant that they might have had terrible experiences, such as seeing the execution of a king. That would be pretty bad. Now, Locke received a classical education in London, so that meant he learned math and reading and Greek and Latin. And he later moved on to Christ Church College in Oxford, and he studied to be a medical doctor. Being a medical doctor in that time period did not take a long time to achieve. I'll probably repeat this over and over again in different lectures, but they had to learn where to put the leeches. There wasn't a lot to learn. Okay, so Locke, he and Sir Isaac Newton, who was a physicist and a mathematician, were lifelong friends. So another possible influence, he's thinking about physics, the perspectives that Isaac Newton would have taken on. They would have had long discussions. Locke was excelled to Holland in 1667. Oh, I'm sorry, expelled, that should have said, with Lord Ashley because of their political views. So politics plays a lot in some of these men's lives, as well as war. So Locke further developed his ideas on government and education in Holland during that time period, and he returned to London at the age of 56. So he was a grown man in many cases. He rejected Descartes' philosophy in support of his own ideas of empiricism and the environment's importance in education. So what do we know about Locke? Well, he had this empiricist theory, and this is a picture of his book, an essay on human understanding, a sort of a blurry one, but nevertheless, it's the original book. Locke believed that all humans were born with equal abilities intellectually. He rejected Descartes' ideas of nature. He's focused on nurture. So we're already seeing nature nurture debate coming up. He focused on nurture being important in human development. He said environment was influencing factor in how individuals developed ideas through their sensory experiences. I would say that he was on the right track. Okay, Locke's essay concerning human understanding in 1690 marks the formal beginning of British empiricism. Yay, Locke. All right, so what's Locke's contribution to psychology today? Well, Locke's view of acquisition and treatment of fears, and similar to 20th century behaviors, Joseph Wolff. Okay, so one of his contribution was the empiricist theory. Sorry, I didn't really present that correctly. And then his other contribution was this view of acquisition and treatment of fears. Um, Locke recognized that kids were afraid of school. They received a lot of canings and beatings. And so he said, similar to 20th century behavior, Joseph Wolff, he said the acquisition and treatment of fears was necessary. He said, I came up with these constructs that we need to expose people to their fear very slowly, and then eventually they'll go through this exposure and they won't have an increase in their terror. And he gave the example that a frog might be something that a child might be afraid of or someone might be afraid of. And so then you slowly expose them to this frog, and then eventually they become less afraid. And if you, so if a person has OCD and they don't like something disgusting like brown bananas, then they would go to a therapist, and the therapist would start off by holding a brown banana, uh, having it in the room, having the person hold it, having them eat it, it would go on and on, like step by step, little baby steps. I made big steps, little tiny steps about this exposure and eventually becoming comfortable with it. And this idea originally came up from Joseph Locke, John Locke, goodness gracious. All right, so another person that's very important during this time period was George Berkeley. And here's a picture of George Berkeley and another picture of George Berkeley. So George Berkeley was from Ireland. He attended Kilkenny College at the age of 15 and Trinity College in Dublin. He wrote a discovery of mathematics, geometry that studies 2 and 3 dimensional shapes. And he wrote this out when he was 20 or before he was 20. So mathematics was something that he excelled at the age of 20, when he made his greatest intellectual contributions, completing 4 important essays. So this was the time period of greatest growth in his intellect. He was ordained as an Anglican churchman and became the Bishop of Coin. An interesting fact about him is that the University of California, Berkeley was named after George Berkeley. So the UC campus, Berkeley, is named after George Berkeley. All right, so he was the second person in Who Are Our Empiricists? Berkeley was the second, and he talked about principles of human knowledge. All right, Berkeley's writings presented an agreement of Locke's ideas on empiricism. He reinforced that all knowledge of the external world comes from experience. So he ran first. Yes, nurture, nurture, nurture. It's people around us. It's environment. Now, Berkeley took the idea further, stating that perception is important to understanding the external world. How we perceive things and think of them, that matters too. Now, Berkeley believed that without perception, the world would not exist. That's true. If you close your eyes, it's not there. But so perceiving something is important. So consider the question. When a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound if no one is present? Berkeley believed the tree did not make a sound because he said that it was perception and the world did not exist unless we were there to perceive it. That's a kind of a famous phrase, does the tree make a noise when it falls in the forest? It's better than me shutting my eyes. That was a pretty weak example. So when a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? And Berkeley said, no, He said it doesn't make a sound because we have to have a perception of the world, otherwise we don't know it exists. All right. So another of his post-Renaissance discoveries in empiricism was he had a criticism was directed at Berkeley by many. Specifically, philosopher Samuel Johnson suggested that if matter did not exist unless we kicked it, then someone should kick a stone at Berkeley's head to clear his fuzzy thinking. Makes me wonder how the University of Berkeley got named after him. If people thought he had fuzzy thinking. Berkeley's response was to state that God perceived all, therefore it existed. Remember, Berkeley was, I can't remember if it was an Anglican, but he worked in the church, further stating that the existence of the world was definitive proof of God. Berkeley was working to counter Isaac Newton's beliefs that the universe is nothing more than a giant automatic machine. Okay, so these were some of his discoveries and beliefs. One of the things that Berkeley did that was really great was he spent a great deal of time thinking about perception. So Berkeley did do good things, and he deserved to be, president, named after the university, UC Berkeley. But anyway, so he wrote a book, or he wrote an essay towards a new theory of vision. This essay was about depth perception and how it might be achieved. What are the cues, concerns of light, and how an object changes as it moves closer or further away from us? Because if something is closer, it's bigger, and if it's further away, it's larger. So closer. Okay. Yeah, I just probably made you sick. You want to see that again? Okay, further away and closer. All right, yeah, that was fun. Got my stomach exercises in. All right, he did not complete experiments to support his theory, but his theory was correct, as I just demonstrated. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so what was his contribution to psychology today? Berkeley extended Locke's ideas of the empiricist theory, focusing on the sense experience of perception. By focusing on perception, Berkeley moved philosophy closer to psychology, and that's really important. So that's a big contribution. Berkeley's essay on depth perception was cited 721 times. In that time period, that was a lot, because remember, there weren't that many people that were working in that field, indicating the impact it had on developing the field of experimental psychology and Wilhelm Wundt's lab in Leipzig, Germany. So 721 times might be equivalent to 721 million times in our current time period. And that's a lot for any paper to be cited that many times. So it was an impressive contribution. Therefore, I accept that he was named, the University of UC Berkeley was named after him. Okay. Next on our agenda is David Hume, and he was born in 1711. Now, he was born in Edinburgh. He had a nice Scottish brogue. His father died when he was 2. It's very interesting. A lot of these men lived very long, but their parents died when they were very young. So I'm not really sure how this all worked out. But anyway, both he and his brother entered the University of Edinburgh at the same time, and David was 12 years of age. Okay, well, often the parent that was still alive in all of these, many of these scholars' cases that we'll talk about, the parent that was alive said, "You're really smart. You're really capable. Wow." All right, just like all your parents do for you, right? Okay, so at 12 years of age, he was perceived by his mother to be exceptionally intelligent. So he didn't graduate and begin a business career. Sometime till later, he became a philosopher, but he didn't graduate. At 26 years of age, he was in France, and written in French, Hume published a treatise on human understanding, eventually returning to Edinburgh, where he died. Well, let's see what he taught us. What are his discoveries? So, post-Renaissance discovery, David Hume was committed to improving upon the work of Locke. and Berkeley in the theoretical constructs of empiricism. Hume's philosophy was a final breaking apart of science and religion. His goal was to create a science of human nature, a science of psychology. So his contribution is he separated science from religion. His focus was on the science of human nature. So he stepped away from who were we talking about before? George Berkeley, who was very invested in religion. And he said it's a science. And Hume believed that emotions ruled logic, providing the direction for once development of the science of the conscious experience over 100 years later in psychology today. Wilhelm Wundt, I'm not going to tell you where he's from because it's exciting. We're going to be on our next adventure. We're going to another country, I can tell you that. Okay, so this was the Renaissance, and the post-Renaissance that was starting off in Italy and moving on. There were two perspectives. As a recap, we started off with, come on, get away from the pigs. All right, Descartes. We had the rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Now, Descartes, I know it's not pronounced Leibniz, but Leibniz, I'm not sure. Descartes was, he's the one that's most important, but the other two are important in the sense that they carried on their work. Now, they were the rationalists, where the next group comes in, the post-Renaissance people, and they are perceived as the empiricists. All right, they believe in empiricism. All right, dialogues concerning natural religion. They wanted to talk about these things. All right. Yeah, we did that one. Okay, I'm just checking. I know I'm making you dizzy with all these back and forth, back and forth. All right, so the summary, the contribution of the Renaissance era to psychology today, the Renaissance and the post-Renaissance, was methodology of designing and a scientific experiment through a rigid process of quantifiable variables, making predictions, and using math to prove or disprove the predictions. And that sounds really strong, but that was Descartes. Remember the Cartesian points, the Cartesian dualism, the mind being separate from the body, and thereby defining psychology as a study of the mind. All right, that was very important. Now, moving on from there is, again, the Cartesian coordinates. The contributions for psychology today were used in graphs based on geometry. Geometry was very important. All right, and then Locke really thought about this philosophical orientation of nativism, born with the idea, nature, which was Descartes, and then this realism, this experience of nurture, which was Locke. So Descartes and Locke started us off on this very important debate of nature versus nurture. And which one? Is it genetics that influences our personality traits? Are we born with our personality completely and 100% intact? No, we are born with personality stuff. Literally, that's what it's called. We have general sense of the personality. We have a way of engaging and interacting with the world, but it's influenced by nurture as time goes on. Our environment, our upbringing, and our life experience determine our behavior. We are nurtured to behave in certain ways. Think of gender. All right, we are born with biological cues of our nature says what our biological cues are for our gender, but it doesn't mean that we feel that way. And also, nurture has a big influence on it. Nurture says we are treated a certain way if we're a boy, or we're treated a different way if we are a girl. So there's different presentations of those two different facts. Additionally, contributions to psychology today, Locke firmly established the empiricist theory focused on experience or nurture, the understanding of acquisition and treatment of fears. What an amazing thing. OCD, and the treatment of a fear of a brown banana can be treated because Locke thought about this. He said, and he didn't like school, and he saw that children were treated badly, and then they didn't want to go to school. And again, remember, these were gentlemen scholars. They had a lot of time to think about things. They didn't have computers and video games and TVs. They didn't have a lot to entertain themselves, but their own mind and what they could create and what they could think about. So, anyway, so he had this idea of dealing with the treatment of fears. He thought about how we acquire them, and he was correct. Another, number 7, that ideas that brought forward to the development of the current field of psychology by Berkeley was A, the senses, depth perception, and B, experimentation. All right, both of these are related to Berkeley. Number 8 for contributions to psychology today. Just like these stack of rocks, we start at the bottom with the philosophers, and we now are adding Descartes and Hume and Berkeley and all of these other individuals. The ideas are coming and they're big ideas, and they're getting refined and refined and refined until it makes sense. And it's the head of psychology that matters. So we focused on human nature by separating religion from science. Hume said that that was really important to do that. Hume's philosophy that emotions rule logic directed Wilhelm Wundt towards the conscious experience. So again, we're moving forward in our ideas and our constructs. And that's the end of this lecture. All right, I will see you next time. Thank you.